So we're now live streaming.
Thank you, Ristea. Thank you so much. Can you please make me the host? Thank you. Welcome, everyone. My name is Kalirois Stavriani, and on behalf of Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I'm very happy to moderate this series of webinars that aim to educate, promote collaboration, and also promote information exchange about healthcare technology, engineering, and patients' outcomes. All our webinars are recorded, archived, and also live streamed on Facebook. Following the completion of the webinar, the recording material will be accessible on our website, www.globalcea.org. Please note that at the bottom of the screen, you have a Q&A button where you can submit questions to the faculty, and those questions will be addressed towards the end of the webinar. In addition, for posting general comments, there is the option of the chat box, which is for audience interaction. Today's webinar is the 5th in the series with the title Global Regulation and standards during the COVID-19 era. Now, I'm very pleased to give the floor to Mlandon Poluta, who is moderating this webinar. Mlandon is a Health Technology Deputy Director at the Western Cape Department of Health and GCA Founders Council member. Mlandon, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Kaliroy. Good evening, good afternoon, good morning, wherever you are. The SARS-CoV-19 pandemic has been a hugely disruptive influence on our lives for 2 years. A frequent focus of attention has been that of regulations and the related restrictions, guidelines, and standards. These have affected us all and continue to do so. However, one of the silver linings of the pandemic has been collaboration across international regions and borders, and even within countries, between groups of stakeholders that previously may not have engaged at all. In some respects, we have become members of multiple virtual villages, gathering to share and discuss issues of common concern and importance. In this webinar, we unpack the concept of regulations from 3 specific perspectives through the lens of medical devices as we transition to a post-COVID new normal. The first is a global WHO perspective. As you know, the World Health Organization has continued to provide guidance and support throughout the pandemic. The second is a regional perspective, in this case, the European region, with a focus on the new European medical device regulations. Last but not least, we have a technical perspective, specifically one addressing conformance assessment of medical devices. Together, these provide an overview of and reflections on the important role of regulation and related standards pertaining to medical devices. Before I hand over to our first presenter, I would like to go to our polling facility and ask 2 simple questions so that we have a sense of who is in this virtual space. So the first question asks, what region are you joining this webinar from? Africa, Asia, Central America and Caribbean, Europe, Middle East, North America, Oceania, and South America. And the second one is this your first GCA webinar? Please respond now. Thank you. So if we look at this, we have colleagues from every single region, which is fantastic because this is truly a global village. We've got good representation from North America, from Europe and Africa, but also from the other regions. So thank you for joining this webinar and once again, welcome. Second question. Kaliroy, the second question didn't come up, but that's fine. Let's continue. So our first speaker hails from Tanzania, supposedly the birthplace of mankind and womankind. She is currently technical officer in the Regulation and Safety Unit and a member of the Facilitated Products Innovation Team at WHO HQ in Geneva. I have the pleasure of handing over to Agnes Sita Kijo for her presentation.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Poluta, for this great opportunity to present to this audience on the global overview of medical devices regulation. I'll straight dive into my presentation. Please, let's go to slide 1. Thank you. I would like to start with this presentation on these two important resolutions of the World Health Assembly. So it's resolution 20.29 and 67.20, which really sets out the framework for an exceptional focus on health technologies and system strengthening activities. So all the regulatory work that we do, at least on the regulation and safety unit, is geared towards responding to these two important resolutions by the member states. Next slide, please. And so to continue with my presentation, and of course, are you on the second slide? Thank you. I also wanted to speak briefly on what should be the spirit of regulation. So when NRA are considering introducing legal framework for medical devices, the spirit of regulation really should not be to hinder or create barrier for the introduction of new innovative diagnostic tests, but rather creating a balance between public safety and innovation. We all understand that the primary goal for the National Regulatory Authority is to protect public health while preventing unsafe and ineffective devices from reaching the market. And the regulations should also articulate should be clearly articulated to stakeholders. And so stakeholders consultation and communication is critical when developing and during implementation of regulations. Of course, in order to identify unsafe and ineffective medical devices in the market, we really need to have in place adequate post-market and pre-market controls. There is also a need to introduce requirements that do not conflict with other internationally accepted standards. And so the issue around international convergence, international harmonization is critical. This has always been a common pain point for manufacturers due to variability of requirements with increased workload, especially when compiling technical files for different markets. Transparent processes and scientific evidences that support regulatory decision-making is also very, very crucial. So this, in essence, should be the spirit of regulation. Next slide, please. This slide shows the global picture in 2019. I promise you next time when I attend this webinar, I'll bring up a more recent picture on what has been happening in the past 6 or 7 years since the introduction of the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework. But this was the picture in 2016 with regards to existence of legal framework for regulating medical devices. We had about 27%, this is about 52 countries with no legal framework. We could make few assumptions here that the products going into these countries, the 52 countries that did not have legal framework, were entering the countries without any regulatory oversight. Another assumption could be there was no regulatory authority existing because there was no legal framework and maybe there was no any mandate in any of the government agencies to regulate these products. But also another assumption could be lack of pre or post-market elements. And this is very, very dangerous. And of course, the existence of substandard and falsified products because of lack of market control. There is an ongoing survey that has indicated around 20% increase in the number of countries with legal framework, but this is just a preliminary result. We will share the final data once the survey has been completed and published. We have also seen a lot of progress in many regions, and especially in Africa in the recent years in this particular area. And so probably the picture would have changed and maybe the number of percentages of countries without legal framework would have reduced significantly. Next slide, please. I wanted to bring you to this particular slide, and I'm not going to go through each and every of these barriers, but I wanted to just highlight to you some of the critical barriers that do exist in many of the regulatory authorities. But I would speak to mostly to those that relate to lack of legal framework, as I have indicated in my previous slide. So one of the critical barrier really is to do with uncoordinated activities among stakeholders and overlapping of activities, because this is really contributed by lack of clear or clarity in the legal provision on who is mandated to regulate medical devices and IVDs. There is also an issue of unclear regulations and requirements, and this could be a result of either lack of a legal framework or outdated piece of legislation or regulation that exists in a specific country, but also lack of regulatory control, because this then would result into inadequate market control. It would result into inadequate or lack of transparency in terms of the processes and predictability of timelines and transparency in terms of the procedures itself. So these are some of the issues that have been really a barrier for most of the manufacturers and those that wishes to introduce new technologies in specific countries. Next slide, please. And so this particular slide, I'm not going to go into this particular slide. I think you will be able to have this later on, just for your own reference, but I would really like to dive into the next slide. So regulation of medical devices, including IVDs, is guided by this nice green book that I'm projecting in this particular slide. In the context of the resolution 67.20 that I mentioned on my first slide, challenges and challenges faced by regulators and the growing interest in the global health community, WHO developed this important document in 2016, and it was later published in 2017. It is relevant to all member states, but most specifically those who are yet to develop systems and those who wish to improve their framework and recommends who wish to improve their framework. It also recommends two-phase approach, and this is the basic level and expanded level. I understand there are other regional frameworks that proposes three phases, but the WHO Global Model Regulatory Framework really recommends only two levels, basic and expanded level. And when I say two levels, it means that this is the staged development of a regulatory system from basic to expanded, depending on identified priority by a specific national regulatory authority, and also depending on availability of resources. The model is currently under revision through a specific working group comprising of national regulatory authorities and other experts on medical devices. I have provided also a link if you would wish to read more about this important guidance document. Next slide, please. I also wanted to speak about three other important tools, and this is the Good Reliance practice, which is shown in this particular slide. It's available as Annex 11 of the technical report series 1030. That is a blue book. And in this particular tool, which is called Good Regulatory Practice, it is stating principles which are critical to efficient performance of the regulatory system and consequently to the public confidence in the system. So all individuals and regulatory authorities are guided by this particular book in setting appropriate requirements and formulating decisions that are clear, transparent, consistent, impartial, proportionate, timely, and based on sound science. There is also another important document which is called Good Reliance Practices. It is also found in the technical report series, that a blue book that I'm projecting there, under Annex 10. WHO supports reliance on the work of other regulators as a general principle in order to make the best use of available resources and expertise. This concept or this principle allows leveraging of output of others whenever possible, while placing greater focus at national level on value-added regulatory activities that cannot be undertaken by other authorities. The most popular examples of reliance concept is the collaborative registration procedure between WHO, national regulatory authorities, and manufacturers, with an agreed regulatory decision within 90 days. So WHO shares assessment reports with the national regulatory authorities with the consent of the manufacturer and the product gets registered within 90 days. Then we have seen a lot of benefits in terms of improved timelines of products during market authorization. And so Reliance really facilitates timely access to safe, effective, and quality assured medical products, and can also support regulatory preparedness and responses, particularly during public health emergencies. I will speak about it a little bit on my next slide. Last but not least is the global benchmarking tool. So this is the means by which WHO evaluates regulatory systems through a comprehensive and systematic benchmarking to identify strength and areas of improvement, but also formulation of institutional development plans. It also aids in prioritization of the institutional development plans, interventions, but also help to monitor progress. The existing tool, which is GPT revision 6, has only covered medicines, vaccines, blood and blood products. But we have recently finished development of a specific tool to assess regulatory systems for medical devices and in vitro diagnostics. The tool will soon be published and piloted in Q2 of 2022. So all these tools have been developed by WHO. So the Global Model Regulatory Framework, Good Regulatory Practice, Good Reliance Practices, and the Global Benchmarking Tool have been developed by the WHO to support regulatory systems strengthening and improve access of the needed products. I have also provided links of each of these documents, very useful document in which I would really recommend that you go through and get familiarized with the concepts that would really facilitate the regulatory work. Next slide, please. So I'm not going to go also into the details of this because I understand everybody is aware of the unprecedented times of the COVID-19 pandemic, where we had few available diagnostics, limited performance data, and yet the products were urgently needed, understanding that there was no fast or efficient regulatory procedure to assess and approve these products. And so there are so many challenges that I have highlighted in this slide for your reference, both at the NRA and the manufacturer. So what did the WHO do at that time to advise and support the National Regulatory Authority during the time of the pandemic? Next slide, please. So as far as WHO is concerned, we really focused on the WHO principles that I have mentioned previously, with the exclusion of the GBT, because the GBT was under development at that time, and I'm referring only to medical devices and IVDs. But let's take an example of reliance and recognition. So this was one of the, I think, major concepts that was used by many of the regulatory authorities in order to facilitate approval of the COVID assays. I've spoken to many regulators in different workshops, and I realized that it is actually at that time when regulators realized the criticality or the importance of utilizing the outcome or leveraging the information from other mature national regulatory authorities. I remember at the beginning of the pandemic, US FDA, for example, came up with about a total of registered 249 molecular diagnostic tests, 14 antigens, 70 serology tests, which really enabled other national regulatory authorities to leverage on this information to allow such products to enter into the market, their markets, for clinical diagnosis of the virus. So reliance and recognition really played a critical role. There was a survey that was conducted by WHO in February 2021, which indicated that at least 80% of NRA relied on listing and authorization by trusted institutions such as WHO and other mature national regulatory authorities for COVID-19 assays. And also around 94% of countries were aware of the WHO emergency use listing, and then they were utilizing it at 68% to facilitate in-country authorization. But another critical principle that is also promoted and was promoted and still promoted by WHO through the Good Reliance Practice guideline that I mentioned on my previous slide is regulatory flexibility. We've seen a drastic drop of market authorization timelines I remember a presentation from US FDA, which also indicated a drop of market approval to between 12 to 24 months, and also a listing or authorization of the COVID assays up to 3 months. And so these are some of the concepts that were implemented and produced very good results in terms of facilitating access of the needed products. Issues around collaboration among stakeholders in the development of technical specifications, sharing of information was the key highlight. And this is one of the principles or one of the key concepts that is also promoted and encouraged by WHO. Also, the other issue is on the development of guidelines, of course, to cater for the public health emergency at that time. There are some of the guidelines documents that were not existing, but we were able to see countries that were, through the regional harmonization initiatives or through their regional economic communities, they were able to come together and develop documents, even in individual national regulatory authorities as well, quick development of guidelines to guide both national regulatory authorities and manufacturers. I recall also a presentation from the US FDA. They were able to develop at least 28 guidelines within a very short period of time. WHO also supported several regions in the development of guidelines. For example, Africa was supported in the development of several guidelines, including donation guidelines, understanding that during the beginning of the pandemic, a lot of products were being shipped or donated to Africa, and also forms and SOPs for reporting defective products. I think I'm going to my last slide. So in the last slide, this is where I want to just give you some of the key messages. And I think for me, it is crucial, and it is very, very important to have a sound legislative and regulatory requirements in place. Both legal framework to define the basis and condition for collaboration and work sharing. This is in relation to the Reliance concept, but also technical frameworks through applicable guidelines. And this is important when there is harmonization or regional harmonization, or when the guidelines have been developed based on internationally recognized standards, as I mentioned also in my previous slide. So importantly is to have a sound legislative and regulatory requirements, which also should be supported by practical arrangements to have in place operational procedures for implementation. And one of the statements that I usually like to speak during the webinars is that, yes, you may have harmonization, but harmonization means nothing if the established guidelines or established provisions are not implemented. And so it is important to support the legislation, to support the regulatory requirements and the regulations by having in place operational procedures to support implementation of these good provisions, but also interpretation of the requirement, competencies of the personnel, issues around capacity development is very, very important. But also, as I mentioned in my previous slide, stakeholder engagement here is also very, very important. Regulatory capacity building, promotion of collaboration that I've already spoken about. But also one of the emphasis that I wanted to put as one of the key messages is on the good regulatory practice. So there is no good regulatory practice without good governance. So issues around accountability, issues around transparency, fairness, and equal treatment of all regulated parties, I think it is very, very important. And these are the concepts that are promoted in the good regulatory practice guideline that was recently published by WHO. And one final key message from me today is that, and this is to do with the Reliance concept, not using the output or outcome from other trusted regulatory authorities. For me, I think that it's a lost opportunity, unnecessary duplication of effort, but also increase the regulatory burden and waste of scarce resource that can be used really to cover other gaps or other areas of the national regulatory authorities which cannot be undertaken by any other trusted institution or matured regulatory authority. So this is what I have for you today, and I hope I've been able to stick to the 15 minutes allocated for this presentation. Thank you very much once again for the opportunity, and I hand it over back to the moderator. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Kijo. You took us through a very comprehensive journey and showed the thought that goes into many of the areas that you've mentioned and the support that you provide. If I could just ask you one question, we are running slightly late, but if I could ask you one question, which in a sense was pointed to by 3 different participants in the chat. And so we're all aware of the leadership that WHO is providing in the space of regulation. Are you aware of research that has been done, business cases formulated that shows the counter benefits of not investing in proper regulation? In other words, if a country is unable to establish a national regulatory authority, there are certainly consequences. And has there been work done on seeing how those situations can be mitigated by perhaps using your regional offices as a hub to support nation states, but really to build a case to policymakers that a national regulatory authority and other related, if you like, agencies or processes, in fact, are a very wise and necessary investment?
Mm-hmm. Thank you very much for that question. So I think I've mentioned briefly on one of the slides where I spoke about barriers, and it's unfortunate that I wasn't able to go through the other slide because I was being cautious about time. But the specific slide that I indicated on the solution for each of these barriers, one of them really speaks about convergence. Convergence, it speaks about collaboration, it speaks about work sharing. And so what we normally advise national regulatory authorities who are yet to implement legal framework for medical devices and IVDs is really to try as much as possible to engage in regional networks. We have very strong, for example, regional networks in Africa. We've seen a lot of good work from SADC region through the Zazibona, but this is a scheme for medicines. We have seen a lot of good work from the East African community, for example, and on all these regional initiatives are under the African medicine regulatory initiatives. So MRH really pulls regulators together in terms of promoting convergence and harmonization, but also advise on how to collaborate and share information among the regulators. There is a specific group, for example, in Africa, it's called the African Medical Devices Forum. So this is the specific group that provides support to the African regulators who may wish to have any kind of support, being technical, being in development of policy, with the secretariat being WHO and the African Union. And so such kind of mechanisms, regional engagement, sharing of information, and the support that comes through, for example, schemes such as the collaborative registration procedure really allows national regulatory authorities to be able to leverage on the work of other institutions while building up capacity in their own countries.
Thank you very much again for that response. And I did post in the chat that you would not be able to stay until the end of the webinar, that you would stay for some minutes. But if there are questions that participants would like to raise, they're welcome to share them with us, provide the email, and you've undertaken to respond to them directly. So thank you for that.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Kaliroy, could we move to the next poll? So there are 3 questions in this poll. So were you or are you aware of the work that WHO is doing in the regulatory space? Yes or no? Are you aware of the WHO global model regulatory framework for medical devices. That's the green book that Ms. Kijo showed in one of her slides. And Ms. Kijo spoke about this Reliance concept, which is also surfaced in other areas outside of regulation. But are you aware of the Reliance concept, or were you aware of the Reliance concept before this presentation? So over to you, please vote. So Kaliroy, when you're ready to show us the results. Well, that's a fantastic response, because it shows that a significant number of people are aware, but equally a significant number of people are not aware. So this is an opportunity, as Ms. Kijo said, for sharing, for networking, for collaborating, so that together we do better and we do more, and we support those countries that have got less capacity, and provide them with the support that they need in appropriate format. So thank you for responding to that poll. So Ms. Kijo, thank you once again. Our next speaker was a member of the A team responsible for hosting a wonderful and memorable third ICE HDM conference in Rome in 2019. He's director at MedTech Projects SRL, a member of the GCA Founders Council, and in his spare time, he plays the tenor sax in a small orchestra. It is my great pleasure to hand over to Stefano Bergamasco.
Thank you so much, Mladen, for the introduction, and thanks to everyone for organizing this webinar, and also for giving me the opportunity of presenting the topic of the European medical devices regulation. There are few reasons why we thought interesting to present in this global webinar the specific experience of Europe. First of all, because we have a significant number of countries that share a common regulatory framework on medical devices. And this is for sure an interesting model. This is not because of a specific agreement between countries because of medical devices, but in general, because of the history of European Union. So we have 27 member states covering 450 million people that share a common regulatory framework. And this is really, really significant. The other reason why it's in this moment interesting to talk about regulations in Europe is that although we are a mature regulatory context for medical devices, but we are right now living a huge change of medical device regulations. We are moving from the, let's say, old European directives on medical devices that are legal documents about the regulations that must be adopted by each single country in the European Union. We are now moving to the new EU regulations that are immediately applicable to all the countries without any need for national transposition. And this will also increase the uniformity of applications of these rules. Next slide, please. So I will introduce the topic using one of the classic models of the life cycle of health technology given by the World Health Organization. I'm using this model because here we cover, from the point of view of the hospital, the life cycle from planning and assessment of medical devices to the purchasing, so procurement and logistic, all the activity of classical activities of clinical engineering, from installation and commissioning, training, operation and safety, maintenance and repair, until the end of the cycle with the commissioning and disposal. A key aspect is that most of the rules in medical device regulation are addressed to medical devices manufacturers and set the rules to place devices on the market, devices that are safe and respond to the essential safety standards and requirements set by the regulations. And only part of these regulations talk about the life cycle of the devices when they are inside the hospitals, post-market surveillance, vigilance with the incident reporting, and so on. However, these regulations usually don't talk about maintenance, periodic safety checks, preventive maintenance, and so on. So most of the activities that we do in hospitals every day. Next slide. And it's interesting to note that at least in Europe, but I guess it's quite the same also in other regions, there are other directives and regulations that are more general than medical devices that address topics that are interesting for our jobs in and profession as clinical engineers. For example, we have the European directives on procurement and accounting that talk about budgeting and procurement rules, but also we have the EU directives on occupational health and safety. It's interesting to note that most of the rules that make mandatory the installation tests or the periodic maintenance of medical devices or the training of the users of medical devices can be found in the legislation about health and safety at work. And this is because medical devices are considered working tools for people and professionals working inside the hospital. So one message here is that for sure we must consider the regulatory framework for medical devices, but we must not forget that there are other regulatory frameworks that also apply to our profession. And so let's be careful to have a comprehensive view of medical devices across the board. So next one. Why are we talking of an epochal change in Europe? We have our medical devices directives that set the legislation for manufacturers of medical devices to put safe devices on the market, and for users, hospitals, and other buyers to buy them and follow the post-market activities. These are legislations that date back to the 90s. So we are talking 30 years ago for medical devices and in vitro diagnostic medical devices. In 2012, there has begun a huge debate in Europe about the need to change these regulations. There has been a couple of scandals. You may have heard of the breast implant scandal in Europe and heart artificial valves. So that raised questions about the effectiveness of the current regulatory framework. So there has been a huge debate, a lot of legislative activity in the European Parliament, and finally the adoption of two new regulations, one on medical devices and one on in vitro diagnostics. And there is now a long transition period between 2017 with the adoption, 2021, the full implementation of the new regulation, so it's really recent. And I'll show you quickly in a slide the transition period until 2025, before all this is fully implemented. But it may stay for other 30 years. So it's very important. We are living interesting times of change between one legislative framework to another. Next one. So this is just the front page of the 745 regulation on medical devices. And the next one is the front page of the 746 regulation on in vitro diagnostic. Next one. I will just leave for reference in the material and in the slides the link to the main page of the European Commission about the new regulation of medical devices. Here we can find all the legislative text, but also a huge number of guidelines. This is very good and very useful because we can find solutions to a lot of doubts and questions, but also raises the question, where the regulations not self-sufficient? We have now more than 50 guidelines from the European Commission explaining specific aspects of implementation of the regulation. So the message here is that these regulations are really complex. And so it's not easy for manufacturers and other stakeholders to follow them properly. Next one. Very quickly, in a couple of slides, I've highlighted from the Commission website those that are considered the most important new elements of these regulations. And these have a clear link to what Agnes was saying before me from WHO for a more global perspective. So what are the important aspects that must be taken into consideration and have been introduced in the new regulation? So, for example, a stricter control for high-risk devices with a pre-market scrutiny with a pool of experts at European level. We have a reinforcement of the criteria to design and process and oversight the notified bodies. Notified bodies in Europe are typically private companies that oversee the certification of high-risk devices from the manufacturer. So on one side, it's very good that the criteria to approve notified bodies themselves have been reinforced because they are a key element of the safety of devices because of the certification, their role in certification of devices. On the other side, it's becoming a bit of a bottleneck because we have now much less available notified bodies than before. And so for a manufacturer, it's becoming more and more complex and long to get a medical device approved at European level. We had the inclusion of certain aesthetic devices that even though they are not medical devices, but they have been included in the field of application of the medical device regulation. Also, this is very important. Just think of some devices like a laser, for example, or a UVC lamp, that if they are used in a hospital for medical purposes, they fall under the regulation and are strictly regulated. If they are just used for aesthetic purposes, they are mostly unregulated or very loosely regulated. Now with the new medical device regulation, even though they are not medical devices, but they must follow the rules. And it's very good, very important. And we have a new risk classification system for IVDs. Also this, on one side, is reinforcing the safety of the system because many more IVDs will now require notified bodies approval and cannot be self-certified by manufacturers anymore. On the other side, this is becoming a new kind of bottleneck to the market for a lot of devices. Next one. So we are going to have a new database of medical devices, a UDI system similar to what is already in place, for example, in the United States, to clearly identify and track medical devices, the introduction of an implant card for patients if they are given implantable devices. A key element, this is really probably the most important element, is reinforced rules on clinical evidence. So there's much more now emphasis on manufacturers to provide clinical evidence before their medical devices can be approved than it was before. And there has been a strengthening of post-market surveillance and an improved coordination between EU countries. So all goes in the direction of providing a safer framework at all European level for medical devices, but it also goes together with problems for all stakeholders to clearly understand and apply this regulation. Next slide. So there has been some infographics from the European Commission to explain the key principle of the medical devices regulation. And one element, I will mention just one that is here, is addressed to the authorities in the member states and non-member states about informing all stakeholders of the changes and the impact that these changes have. Next one. This is, I will not go into the details of explaining these infographics, it's very complex, but give you the idea of the transition period. On the first line, we have the life, let's say, of the medical devices directives, and on the second line, we have the new medical device regulation. As of 26th May 2021, the old directives have been cancelled, and now only the MDR is in place. However, for a certain number of years, until 2024, 2025, with different rules, legacy devices that were previously approved under the medical device directives can still be put into the market in Europe. So this gives all the stakeholders and hospitals mainly time to adapt to the new medical devices regulation, and will give the possibility to manufacturers to gradually relabel and recertify their devices under the new regulation. Next one. I will go towards the end of my presentation. I wanted to touch the topic of technical standards, because sometimes it's also misunderstood. We are talking with a lot of people about the national laws, regulations, directives, and technical standards, but the difference is not always very clearly perceived. As we all know, we have to follow the rules, and basically we have to obey the mandatory rules that are set in the laws and regulations. However, we need technical standards to know, as manufacturers, for example, the technical solutions that respond to the state of the art. Inside the regulation, this article says that if a device is in conformity with the relevant harmonized standards, then they shall be presumed to be in conformity with the legal requirements of the regulation. So there is a presumption of conformity. The key element here is that the technical standards are not mandatory. A manufacturer may choose a different technical solution than what is stated in a technical standard. However, they set the state of the art and are the best way towards conformity. So this is the use of technical standard. Next one. And there is a very interesting document from the Medical Device Coordination Group, that is a group of experts from all member states under the umbrella of the European Commission. They are publishing a lot of guidelines, and there is a guidance on standardization for medical devices that was published in April last year that gives some interesting elements. Next one. In this guideline, I just highlighted a couple of key aspects. First of all, the role of harmonized standards is key, and the content of legislation establishes essential safety requirements. The technical details supporting those requirements are inside the technical standards. You can find technical solutions in the technical standards, not in the laws and regulation. Next one. And as I was saying, there is a presumption of conformity with the legal requirements, but technical standards are generally voluntary. They are not mandatory. But set a very important framework, and this is an international standard framework with the ISO, IEC, and so on, for all the countries to follow. So I will close next one with the final takeaway message. So EU legislation favors free trade, is the previous one, thanks. We are now entering into application with 2 new regulations. There are many new elements, very complex, and a lot of work for the manufacturers to comply, but also for the procurement system and so for hospitals and clinical engineers in hospitals to learn the new rules and apply them correctly when they purchase equipment and when they do post-market. There is a transition period, and it was re-established and reinforced the key role of technical standards as an element to support, from the technical point of view, the actual application of the new regulations. So I thank you very much. So next one to close. I really thank you very much. I'm here available for questions. And although this was focused on Europe, I think that gives some ideas on how the practical application of the concepts that Agnes was explaining at a global level. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Stefano, again, for taking us through the complex space. I think for someone looking from the outside, we wouldn't know where to start. So thank you for unpacking the complexity and presenting it so lucidly. Thank you also for reminding us about the importance of occupational health and safety. We sometimes tend to focus on the narrow areas around clinical engineering and health technology management, but forget that there is this broader umbrella under which we all fall as professionals and as healthcare workers. And there certainly are linkages to what is prescribed by the occupational health and safety regulations and standards. And thank you also to you and your colleagues for leading in this space. You were the first when COVID first started to advise colleagues around the world of the importance of non-invasive respiratory support devices. And you are now leading in terms of the medical device nomenclature, European medical device nomenclature. So congratulations, and please extend our appreciation to your colleagues. Thank you, Stefano. There is a question posed by Yadin in the chat, Stefano, if you'd care to respond. But for now, could we go to the next polling questions? So 2 questions. First question, how is medical equipment referred to in the EU directives on occupational health and safety? As expensive toys, dangerous goods, working tools, potentially harmful aids? So slightly tongue-in-cheek, but a very important question. Second, are the new European medical device regulations likely to impact on medical devices used in your country or region? Yes, no, possibly, or I don't know. Please vote now. Whenever you're ready, Kaliroy. So for the first question, yes, the majority were correct. They are referred to as working tools. Thankfully, nobody saw them as being referred to as dangerous goods. But there is some criticism around medical devices and their pricing and structure, so perhaps the expensive toy option is justified, and they are potentially harmful. We acknowledge that. And then for the second question, again, which shows that we are really part of a global village, that the majority of those who responded felt that the new European medical device regulations would likely impact on medical devices used in their country and their region. So thank you again for responding. So Stefano in his presentation referred to standards and conformity to standards, and that leads us into our third and final presentation. So our good friend Almir Badnievich has many affiliations, too numerous to mention here. Of note, he is director at VERLAB Sarajevo. He's executive director of the International Academy of Sciences and Arts in Bosnia and Herzegovina, associate professor in the faculties of engineering and natural sciences and in the faculty of pharmacy at the University of Sarajevo, president of the Bosnia and Herzegovina Medical and Biological Engineering Society. And just to underline his celebrity status, in 2018, Saturday Night Live magazine named him Person of the Year in Bosnia and Herzegovina. Almir, over to you.
Thank you very much, Mladen. Good evening to all of you. As Mladen said, I will talk a little bit about the standards which we can use for conformity assessment testings of different medical devices in accordance with the international and national, let's say, regulations. Okay, next slide. So at the beginning, we will talk, of course, about the current state and what was the motivation why to talk about that. Next slide. So the facts which you all knows, and the facts which we, let's say, see every day in all of the hospital in all over the world. First of all, we all know that the patients go under a series of different tests, medical tests, diagnosis, treatments, etc., etc. And even in the same countries and even in the same, let's say, cities or towns, they repeat the same test because, let's say, there is no trust in that previous measurement, in that previous diagnosis, etc., etc. Also, there is, let's say, a lot of results. Some of them are presented in the form of the numbers, some of the graphs, some kind of the images, etc., etc. But some of in the different type of the units for the measurements, etc., etc. So at the end, we can say definitely that there is no some kind of the standardized measurement or the data which we gather and which we present, let's say, based on that measurement. Also, definitely we can say that we are spending too many repeatings and too many tests which are unnecessary. If we start from some kind of the blood test up to medical imaging, etc., etc., because many things don't change, for example, in 24 hours, 48 hours, etc., etc., but they're repeating it. So there, we issued and we found out that there is one huge problem, of course, which all of those standards and regulations are trying to solve. Next slide. So there is a question which we must ask to ourselves. Let's say, do we have the same measurement from medical device everywhere in the world? Of course, all of you will say that we don't have, but can we go to the next slide? Next slide, please. The first picture, if we just look, let's say, at the Europe, we can see that this orange line is in fact the different national or international or different practice, etc., etc. Let's say law, regulation, directive, etc., etc. How to test, how to inspect medical device, what to do with it, what to do with pre-market, what to do, especially with the post-market, because let's say by all of those regulations and directives, pre-market is sold very well, but the post-market is not really sold almost anywhere in the world. So there is a lot of things which should be, let's say, standardized. And when we standardize those things, then we can compare all of those data through all over the world, and then we can conclude and give some kind of conclusion. And you will see later on probably to include the artificial intelligence to talk about the management of medical device based on the artificial intelligence, etc., etc. Can we go to the next slide? So there is a second question that we don't care when we are talking about the medical device. We don't care about the importance of the measurement in this case. And there is very important question, does it matter how it's measured? Of course it matters. Does it matter how it's measured when we are talking about the weighting, for example, the gold? Of course it is. And then we are talking about the accuracy, then we are talking about the traceability. Is it important when we are talking about, for example, the gas, oil, etc., etc.? Yes, everything is important. Everyone is using the term which is called metrology there. But when we are talking about the medical devices and the measurement which are coming to diagnosis and treatments, etc., etc., let's say we forget a little bit about the metrology, about the traceability of the measurement, etc., etc. Next slide. But like in all other measurement, like in all other units, like in all other quantities, etc., etc., we can say definitely in God we trust, but all other must bring data. The same thing is with medical devices. So only if we measure something, but when I say measure, it means if we measure based on the traceability and if we know the accuracy, precision, etc., etc., then we can talk about the secure, then we can talk about the safety, performance, reliable, etc., etc. of medical device. Can we go to the next slide? This is not just something, what are we talking about? The whole world, you can find the many different in the media, news about the bad medical device, about the deaths, about the injuries, and all of them most of them was services, etc., etc. If you go to the US FDA, MAUDE database, you can find many things and many cases in the previous, which let's say which occur. Then you can say you can find a lot of countries who reported some cases about the deaths, about the injuries, etc., etc. But also you will find out that there is no many of the countries inside. So that's definitely something what is not covered for whole world. From if we go to Europe, there is something what they have on the mind, and it's calling EUDAMED, European Database of Medical Devices. And there is a question: how can we enter the data, concrete data, performance measurement or conformity assessment testing data from medical devices if we don't have the standardized procedures how to measure all of those performances, conformity assessment, etc., etc. So it's not covered. That's huge question, let's say, for the EUDAMED database tool on European level. Next slide, please. So the current state, definitely we can say that based on the statistics, based on the data which are available, we have the millions of the injuries and thousands of deaths every year, which are linked to the faulty medical devices from year to year. Next slide. Also, we should have on the mind that the world has changed. So the principle of the insurance, safety, and performance of medical device needs to be adopted as well. It's not the same, for example, 30 years ago when we used, for example, mechanical ventilator or something similar. And when we look at the service manual for preventive maintenance, etc., etc., and now with much more electronics, their procedures are pretty similar like before the 30 years. Also, it's not the same. Medical device is like let's say, like some kind of the person. It must be a personalized let's say, preventive or management of medical devices. So only based on the real measurement from that device and taking into account all of the parameters from the working hours, from the history of the preventive maintenance, etc., etc., we can talk about personalized, and we can talk about very planned and very accurate maintenance and managing of medical devices. So that's something what is very important now. Next slide, please. When you go into the details, you can find in goal 3 that UN defined as sustainable development goals that ensure healthy lives and promote well-being for all ages. When you go into the details, you will find out that they're talking also about all of those things, and they're talking how it's important to have reliable, how it's important to have precise, accurate measurement. Next slide. So based on that, we come to some kind of, let's say, solution. And the solution is, in fact, to implement some kind of, in each country, accredited laboratory, or where it is a European, let's say, medical device regulation, it will be a notified body, which will be, of course, a third-party body, which will do inspection of medical devices. On that way, that while they're measuring and while they're inspecting or verifying those medical devices, they will, in fact, also establish the medical measurement traceability chain, which will in fact prove and which will guarantee the accuracy and reliable diagnosis and the treatments. For that, we will get also the protected patients and much safer and precise measurements. Next one. Next slide. So how we should do that? So go to the next slide, please. First of all, to implement those things, we should take care and we should have a knowledge about three things, three fields. The first field is medical devices, because we are talking about the medical devices. Then about the metrology, because if we are using metrology for accurate and precise measurement in all other units, in all other cases, we should do it also for the medical devices. And of course, we should use the standardization, because without the concrete standards and use of metrology on medical device, we will not get the full picture. Next slide, please. In accordance with that, and let's say this gap is recognized also by IEEE standards, which started with this implementing the series for the medical device with the measuring function, and now IEEE standards P2727 is in fact for the medical device with the measuring function function group, and we call that standard for general vocabulary for conformity assessment of medical device with the measuring function. While the first part and the first test will be, for example, for the cardiac defibrillators. In fact, the standard for conformity assessment testing of cardiac defibrillator for legal metrology purposes. And this standard, of course, we have an infinite number of numbers. So there is many medical devices. So it can go P2727.1 up to how much we have different kind of the medical devices. And this is the group where we invite all of you who want to contribute for developing of all other standards for conformity assessment testing of medical devices. Next slide, please. Next. So as solution of this framework, which I already said, based on these three fields, medical device metrology and standardization, we are presenting this one, and that's something how it should work, and it is working, of course, in many countries. That from medical devices, the most important part is safety, performance, accuracy, and reliable. So how can we establish the safety, performance, etc., etc., by doing inspection? How should we perform inspection? By using the ISO 17020 standard, which is international standard for inspection bodies. With what those national bodies or inspection laboratories should have? They must have etalons, which are calibrated and which has established traceability. How? By the calibrating their etalons in accordance with ISO 17025 standard. Then in accordance, when we use those etalons for inspection of medical devices, we will have the safety and performance established, and also we will have the accuracy and reliability of our diagnosis and the treatments. Next slide, please. When we are talking about these concrete cases, here is one very nice picture on the bottom of this presentation, where you see this doctor who is doing some kind of diagnosis of this patient by using the medical devices, which is inspected by the national notified body or the inspection body in one country, which calibrated their etalons by the National Metrology Institute, which calibrated their etalons on the international primary standards, which are calibrated in accordance with the definition of SI units. So based on that, we have the established traceability of our diagnosis in accordance with definition of SI units. So with every single diagnosis and treatment, we know how it's really far from our real value and real measurement, because, you know, in every case, it's just some kind of approximation. Next slide. And how it looks like when you look at the framework for each country. Every country is, let's say, is referenced on some kind of international and or European documents, such as European accreditation, ILAC, MRAS, etc., etc. And every country has the National Institute for Accreditation, National Institute of Metrology, and the National Institute for Standardization. So based on those national institutes, we can establish an inspection body, or we can call it also the notified bodies, which will do the calibration in accordance with the accreditation and national metrology things. National metrology institutes, where there is no some kind of, let's say, international regulation, can establish their rule books, which are in fact based on the legal metrology rules from that country. And those inspection bodies, in fact, will be able to do inspection or verification of all of those medical devices. And as you already know, when something is in legal metrology framework, then it's regulated by the country. So in every case, you have established and you have by the country inspections and other things that you really have to do it. And at the end, please go to the next slide. I will finish my presentation with let's say, some important things, and that we have only one life, we have only one chance. So please, I think that we really should take care about our life and our diagnosis and treatments. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Almir. You also likewise have taken us through what is a very complex space, but highlighted important points and thoughts for us to consider. I guess the one question that comes to mind, you know, for all three speakers, following some of the comments in the chat, is that Almir, yourself, Stefano, and Agnes have presented, if you like, good or best practice. And I think the challenge for all of us as a global community is how can we take elements of that and develop a whole range of implementation scenarios so that even in a poorly resourced setting, there is maximum impact of some of the elements that the three speakers have touched on. So thank you very much for that presentation again, Almir.
Thank you,
Kaliroy, could we go to the last poll? So this obviously refers to Almir's presentation. So would the approach and related infrastructure and processes as shared by Professor Badniewicz be implementable in your country? And you choose one of these. We already have similar structure and processes. Conformity assessment checks are conducted by clinical biomedical engineering departments as part of their responsibilities. We do not have similar structure and processes in place, but it would be important to establish something similar. We do not have the resources to do so. Medical device measurement inaccuracy would be noticed and acted upon by the health professionals applying or using the devices, i.e. there is no need for proactive checks. And last, we rely on adverse events to flag faulty devices. So could you choose one of those and vote now, please? Kaliroy, when you're ready. So from the response, we see the important role, by implication, the important role played by clinical and biomedical engineering departments, and perhaps empowering them to do, if you like, a minimum set of the tests, the conformity assessment checks that Almir have described. It is encouraging to know that there's variation in the responses. There's in fact at least one response to all of the options, which I think again raises the point or makes the point that we are a global community and some are better resourced than others, and certain environments are more enabling and supporting than others. But if we learn from one another and if we work together, we can actually improve the situation for everybody. So I would like to close. Kaliroy, thank you very much. Could I ask Almir or Stefano, do you have any final comments from your side as panelists? I believe Agnes has left us.
Currently, I'm answering on some of those questions, so which are already let's say marked, and which currently we can find in the questions and answers. So for all others also I'm open, and all others, if you have any questions regarding this presentation or anything from this field, please be free to contact me, to send me an email, and we can share all of those information.
I also, of course, available through the organization of the webinar to share the slides and answer any additional questions. I would like only to take the chance to go back to the chat, one of the questions that were posed by Yadin that asked how expertise like clinical engineers is included in generation of directives. Are experts invited or appointed to certain action groups? I would like to take the chance of this question to give a message about the importance of initiatives like the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, because mostly in the generation of the new European regulations, the community of clinical engineers were not really involved. There has been some involvement by the lobbying of manufacturers, but not really so much from clinical engineers. And we talked with some of our contacts in the European Commission and proposed that, for example, as Italian clinical engineers, we could contribute to some of the discussion tables, technical tables, and so on. And there was a very, very, very interesting answer that they said, look, as a European Commission, European Parliament, we can only invite a European level entity. So if you set up an entity that brings together more countries in a kind of an alliance, kind of way, we could invite you to discuss this topic. So in this moment, we have, for example, Ivds, with the leadership now of Leandro Pecchia, our good friend, that is making some initiatives with the European Parliament. But as clinical engineers, not really. And so we are trying to establish, also with the help of Almir and other colleagues across Europe, a European Federation of Clinical Engineering Associations that is kind of following the model of the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance and will be part of the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance. So what I want to say is that if we want our voice to be heard at global level, at regional level, and so on, we must bring countries together and build bridges across countries. And the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance, I think, is doing exactly this.
Thank you, Stefano. Very, very useful and interesting comments again. Thank you for that. So I think we've come to the end of the webinar. I'd like once again to thank Almir, Stefano, and Agnes in their absence. I'd like to thank Kaliroy for providing the enabling environment and the very efficient support and running of this webinar. But primarily, and most of all, I'd like to thank those of you who've joined us. I see that most of you who were at the beginning of the meeting are still here. I see some familiar names. So thank you for joining, and I trust this has been an interesting experience for you. And we look forward to welcoming you in future webinars. I should mention that our colleague Saeed Khalil from Brazil is the coordinator of the Education Committee of the Global Clinical Engineering Alliance. He's coordinating this series of webinars, and he will be also coordinating the training courses to come. So with that, let me thank you all for making time to join us in this important webinar. And I hope that many of us can take many actions from this and hopefully establish some new collaborations so that we can work together for the global good wherever we are, and ultimately for the good of our patients and our communities. So thank you very much. And good night, good afternoon, good morning.
Thank you.
Thank you. See you. Bye-bye.
Bye.